Good afternoon, everybody. Please come in, have a seat. We'll get started with this session. Good afternoon. My name is Daniel Zarin, and it's my privilege to serve as the moderator of this session on assessing the role of transparency of spatial information in transforming the forest sector. It's become a cliche of modern life that knowledge is power. What this means is that people with knowledge have power. Technology and communication provide that access. And transparency is the democratization of that access. And it can be profoundly, even violently disruptive. The objective of this session is to assess the role of transparency of spatial information in transforming the forest sector. Transformation itself is an inherently disruptive process. We're going to talk today about different types of spatial information. Maps of deforestation, maps of natural resources, and maps of people's rights to those resources. Maps themselves are the powerful and potentially disruptive essential representation of spatial knowledge. This afternoon, we're blessed with a diverse panel of what I would characterize as very disruptive individuals, including representatives from the countries with the largest area of forest in each of the main tropical forest regions, Brazil, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, each of which are at very different points on the spectrum between poorly and fully transparent with respect to spatial information. And we're also joined by a colleague from the UN REDD program. So I'd like to take a moment just to introduce our panelists, and then I'll say a word about the structure of this session. We're not going to speak in the order in which we're sitting here, but immediately to my left is excuse me, I'm going to need help on last names, but it's Barth Boyka Mahambi Yela Barthelme. Close enough? Yeah. Thank you. From the Natural Resources Network in the DRC. Tasso Acevedo, who now describes himself as a socio-environmental entrepreneur. Tasso was also the founding director of the Brazilian Forest Service and the architect of the Amazon Fund. Pakoni Nirarta Samadi with the Presidential Delivery Unit in Indonesia, who is the person behind the One Map initiative within Indonesia, and Estelle Fak from the UN REDD program. I'm speaking more slowly than I usually do for the benefit of our translators, who apparently reported that despite Francis's instructions this morning, everyone spoke too fast on the panel, so I want to also urge my panelists to speak at a rate that can be translated. And I'd like to have us get started. In the first part of our session this morning, we'll follow a similar format to that which we had in the plenary. I'm going to pose a question to each of the panelists in turn. They'll each have no more than 5 minutes to respond. After which I'm reserving to myself the right to follow up with a short question. I may or may not exercise the right with each of those. And then we'll proceed to the next panelist. In the second part of the session, I'll facilitate a discussion among the panelists. We'll have a variety of questions. We'll see what comes out of their presentations and follow up on that. And then we'll have the last half hour of the session where we'll open up to questions and answers from the Q&A from the audience and continue the discussion. The intent here is to have a dynamic and fluid conversation among the group on the platform first, and then to extend that out to the rest of you. So let's get started. I'm going to start with Tasso. And Tasso, I'd like to ask you, based on the experience that Brazil has undertaken in transparency of spatial information, really over the past 20 years, going on 20 years, 15, 20 years. What are the most important ways in which civil society has advanced the transparency agenda in Brazil, not only with respect to deforestation monitoring, but also with respect to the demarcation of public lands, the titling of private lands, and the newer instruments around environmental registration and land use licensing?
I think that there is, I have to say thanks, and it's, forget this part, okay. Let's go for the 5 minutes. But it's registered. I think that we have two phases that we must recognize in Brazil in relation to the transparency issue and the advances that we have in the civil society to help to leverage also the level of in-depth monitoring that we have over the forest. I would say that the first phase goes from '88 to 2003. That was the period where our spatial agency, INPE, have developed this system to every year give information on the rates of deforestation in the Amazon region, and specifically on that part of our country. It's 50% of the land, about 70% of the forest. And I would say this is the first stage because by many reasons, access to satellite images, also for the the complexity of doing the analysis at that point, all the maps were basically done by hand and things like that. So the level of transparency of the information was limited to basically have the results. So everybody could access the result of what was the rate of deforestation at each specific year. By 2003, there was a decision from the government to put out all the information available, including the raw material that was used to produce those maps. That was possible also because there was a lot of advance on the technology, on how you do the mapping. A lot of the things were done digitally and etc. So it allows to have the material. And also because the contracts that INPE has with the satellite images allow them also to put it out, all the satellite images. So from 2003 on, all the raw material, all the information actually gets to the internet. And this allows for many organizations on the civil society, including the universities, NGOs, and others, to actually use those materials to create other products. So some organizations would work, for example, on monitoring the indigenous reserves, so getting information for that. Some others will be working with protected areas, will make specific maps about the protected areas. And eventually, we have organizations creating their own systems to monitor the deforestation, forest degradation, logging, and so on. And so since 2003, the advance on what we actually are seeing on the changes on the Amazon forest has increased a lot in terms of how many systems we have available. We have at least 3 independent systems today monitoring deforestation, degradation in different levels in the Amazon region. So, and I think that's possible because of this transition where all the information was made public, and this allows for a more broad transparency. Also, this process was possible because many of the organizations, the civil society, started to work with GIS systems very early on the 90s. And so when it comes up that the government put out the information, there was some capacity in the society to actually use those informations to create something new. So that was key. Now, during this process, there was a lot of innovations being created in the society that was also incorporated by the government. And I would say that the most prominent one is a system that is used today to register what we call the environmental register of the land, which is every landowner has now to make a map of their land and the forest that is over the land and etc. And it's based on the system that was developed by organizations in the civil society, and now it's incorporated on the law in the public domain. Now that's a good part of the story that I think, but I think we still have a lot of challenge in Brazil in relation to this process, and I don't know how much time I have because.
You're going to stop there.
Okay.
Thanks,
No
Tasa.
challenge? Okay.
Let me just ask you a quick follow-up, because what you focused on primarily was on the deforestation monitoring and then a bit about land use licensing. One of the challenges that is shared across the countries that we're talking about today is around the rights to land. And in Brazil's case, one of the issues is around land titling. A month or so ago, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about transparency in that space, reflecting on a report I think I read about a month or so ago, where in the state of Mato Grosso, after finally doing the digitization, or the digitization process of land titling in the state, it turns out that there's just a tremendously larger amount, like 5 times as much area that has been titled as there is actually area in the state. And so what's your sense of how that process goes forward and how it's going to get resolved? And I'll give you 90 seconds to answer that.
Yeah, I think that's a problem that it's not too much linked to transparency at this point, but it's simply the documentation of the land that was done in the past it had no control of borders. You have different jurisdictions in Brazil giving different titles. You have state titles, so the state government was giving. There was some things that were done on federal level, and there are even titles that come from before we actually was a republic, that was kind of titles given by the emperor or something like that. So it's very confusing. And there is still titles from Bolivia, for example, because part of Brazil was at the other side before, and that they have those old titles. So it's kind of messy. So this process of registering the land is the first step of trying to clear up this on large scale, which is because now it's not based on the title, the paper itself. It's based on the real thing that's on the ground. You go there and design. This is the land that actually I'm using, and I'm responsible for. And then afterwards, we will sort out who is actually the owner of each piece of land. But one key interesting thing about this information in Mato Grosso and also in other states is that although if you sum up all the titles, you have more land than what is there. If you sum up the titles, the public titles, which are the only ones that we are for sure that is completely secure, they are 75% of the Amazon. So it's even worse because all those private titles should be in 25% of the land. So,
all right, we'll follow up on these issues later on. Move on to Paconi, and in this new role that you've taken on, really for the past few years, you've been involved in a very exciting and challenging process in Indonesia, in making, in many cases, spatial data transparent for the first time. And I thought it would be useful to hear you speak a little bit about what the constraints are that you face in Indonesia on making spatial data transparent, and how are you going to overcome those constraints? And maybe give some specific focus in your answer to questions around the location and the extent and ownership of the concessions for land use in Indonesia.
Thank you. Thanks for calling me disruptive person. In a positive way, of course. Yeah. Well, formally, we do have a law on public information disclosure, which is dated back to 2008. But then again, as most of our regulation, it is not being followed up by a good operational regulation, if you like. So most of information, including geospatial information that has to be shared, is actually being kept by themselves, although we have the regulation. But if we try to have a closer look to the reason why they're keeping their own information by themselves, is because they have a lack of confidence in the standard being set up by our agency on geospatial information. The standard is supposed to be issued by this agency and supposed to be adopted by other ministries so that it will resulting in a let's say synchronized geospatial information. But that is not the story. The standard is not seen as credible by other ministries and state agencies. Therefore, they try to develop their own and produce maps, and they have reluctancy to share, and therefore they don't want to make this public. But including in the sector of forestry, they already have ministerial decree or ministerial regulation dated back to 2011. But also, people find it hard to find the information that they trying to find, including maps. Yeah. A lot of issues, and among other things is the one that I previously mentioned. But we using the momentum of moratorium on new license on forest area and peatlands, we embark on at least two initiatives that try to overcome the situation whereby we cannot access geospatial information. One is, of course, the One Map, and I would say that One Map is not my work. It's actually collaborative work among ministry and state agency. What I do is just facilitating them to see a common goal and common perspective in regard to geospatial information management and the use of synchronized information, which is more beneficial than what it was back then. Yeah. And that is One Map. And the other would be a roundtable. For me, this is a very landmark event, roundtable on deforestation calculation. Yeah. It was an international event. I invited TASO at the time, but could not meet the deadline of visa issuing or passport, if I'm not forgotten. During that event, we come up with two different numbers, if you like. One coming out a formal number from our Ministry of Forestry, and the other coming up from Matt Hansen, someone that very prominent in this area. Those two numbers are different, but that event put us in a situation whereby everyone, I mean, from our government side, from the CSO, even international NGO, as well the academician, know that the data being used are actually the same, but the way they come up with assumption and methodology and perspective are different. But the difference is not something that it's not something that is bad. Yeah. As long as you use the same data, as long as you open in regard to your methodology, your assumption, and that is fine. And that is that event provide a momentum for the Ministry of Forestry to then more open on their data. So there will be a formal launch on their website, which probably accumulated most of their data and information on forestry on the second week of November. Yeah. I hope that it's really happening, and I hope that you can use that website to access our information on forest. On that particular issue, the concession, well, it is also stated within that Ministry of Forestry regulation that that kind of information, I mean concession and the name of the concession holder, the location and all, it can be accessed by the public. Yeah.